Time to add some controls so that the user can actually control which ingredients the burger should have or should not have. Now for that, we need to add the build controls. And we'll add this component in the burger folder. I'll add a new subfolder, which I'll name build controls. And there I will add a build controls.js file. Now the build controls will be a functional component. So build controls is a function which receives props and which will return some JSX in the end. Therefore, we of course also need to import React from React, and we can then export the build controls function as a default. Now, how should build controls look like? Now, of course, the styling as always is up to you. I want to have a div which I'll use to give this area some styling. And in there, I want to have my various build controls. Now, let's start with styling that area. For that, I'll create a new file, build control.css, and I will add a build controls. The file should be named build controls2, just like the JSS file is plural. So in the CSS file, I will add a build controls CSS class. And I want to give my build controls a width of 100%. And for the background color, I picked a nice orange brownish color, CF8 F2E. I like this color for that. The display shall be flexbox to position all these build controls correctly. I'll set the flex flow to column to position them beneath each other, so in a column instead of in a row. I want to align all the text in the center. I want to give my box a tiny box shadow, only at the bottom, 1 pixel spread, and use this gray as a shadow color. Margin auto, and add a padding of, let's say, 10 pixels and 0 from left and right, because text should be centered anyways. Now this is my build controls area. Of course, we should add some content to the build controls area. And there I want to have a couple of build controls, you guessed it. Now, in my opinion, it makes sense to also outsource these build controls, because it's not just one button. It's a label and then 2 buttons, and it's basically a reusable UI element. So putting it into its own component makes a lot of sense. So inside build controls, I'll add the build control folder, and there the build control.js file, and already the build control.css file for the styling thereafter. Let's start in the JS file though. Build control, this component, will also be a function, will receive props and return some JSX, will import React from React as you always know it, and will export build control as the default. Now we have to decide how a build control should look like. Now we'll use a div as a wrapper, also for styling, and then my build control should in the end have a div which contains the text for that build control, basically the text, the name of the ingredient I want to add. So there I want to output something dynamically, and I will receive a prop for this, and I want to name it label. You can of course choose any name you want. Could name it ingredient label, whatever you need. Next to it, there will be 2 buttons. The first button is of course there for removing an ingredient, less, and then I'll duplicate it to also have a more button. Now I have 2 buttons which allow me to remove and add ingredients. Now I will need some CSS for this build control to look good. So let's head over to the CSS file, and there let's add build control, this CSS class. I want to use flexbox to position the div with the text and the buttons. Flex flow will be row, so the default. I want to distribute them with space between so that they keep some distance from each other. And I will align all the content in the center for vertical alignment. And I will assign a margin of 5 pixels from top to bottom so that there is some space between the individual build controls, but 0 from left to right. Now in the build control, we have a button, of course, and the button should be of display block. Normally it's inline. Here I will override this to be a block style button. I want to inherit the font and set the padding to 5 pixels, margin to 0 or 5 pixels. Width 80 pixels should look good, and the border will be 1 pixel solid, and then AA 17, excuse me, that's also a brown color. Cursor should be pointer, and I want to remove that outline you have by default. Now, there are way more styles we can add to style the button and all the labels. To shorten this, I will attach a file with all the other styles, and you can simply add them below here. Actually, the attached file will contain the styles for this whole file, so you may simply replace everything in here with it. These are all just styles to make sure we have classes to style the less and more buttons differently, and even disable buttons. With that, let's go back to our JavaScript file, to the React code for which you're all here, I guess. So let's now import this classes object from our CSS file so that we can start using these CSS classes. And let's attach a class to our wrapping div. Here, this will be the build control class. I also need a class for my label div. Here, I will use classes and then label. This was one of the CSS classes you just imported. And the buttons also will receive class names. The less button, for that I got the less class, and the more button, for this button, you might not guess it, but there I have the more button. Like this. Now a single build control is styled. The next step, which we'll do in the next lecture, is to now create an array of such build controls in the build controls component. Let's do that together in the next lecture.